Over 2 millennia ago, a young king from the small kingdom of Macedon set out to change the course of history. His name was Alexander, and through unparalleled ambition and military genius, he forged one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Alexander's journey was one of conquest, courage, and relentless determination. This is the history and story of Alexander the Great.
Alexander the Great, born 356 BCE, Pella, Macedonia northwest of Thessaloniki, Greece, died June 13, 323 BCE. Babylon near Al-Willa, Iraq, was the king of Macedonia 336 to 323 BCE, who overthrew the Persian Empire, carried Macedonian arms to India, and laid the foundations for the Hellenistic world of territorial kingdoms. Already in his lifetime the subject of fabulous stories, he later became the hero of a full-scale legend bearing only the sketchiest resemblance to his historical career.
Early life. He was born in 356 BCE at Pella in Macedonia, the son of Philip II and Olympias, daughter of King Neoptolemus of Epirus. From age 13 to 16, he was taught by Aristotle, who inspired him with an interest in philosophy, medicine, and scientific investigation, but he was later to advance beyond his teacher's narrow precept that non-Greeks should be treated as slaves. Left in charge of Macedonia in 340 during Philip's attack on Byzantium, Alexander defeated the Mede, a Thracian people. 2 years later, he commanded the left wing at the Battle of Chaeronea, in which Philip defeated the allied Greek states, and displayed personal courage in breaking the sacred band of Thebes, an elite military corps composed of 150 pairs of lovers. A year later, Philip divorced Olympias, and, after a quarrel at a feast held to celebrate his father's new marriage, Alexander and his mother fled to Epirus, and Alexander later went to Illyria. Shortly afterward, father and son were reconciled and Alexander returned, but his position as heir was jeopardized. In 336, however, on Philip's assassination, Alexander, acclaimed by the army, succeeded without opposition. He at once executed the princes of Lyncestis, alleged to be behind Philip's murder, along with all possible rivals and the whole of the faction opposed to him. He then marched south, recovered a wavering Thessaly, and at an assembly of the Greek League of Corinth was appointed generalissimo for the forthcoming invasion of Asia, already planned and initiated by Philip. Returning to Macedonia by way of Delphi, where the Pythian priestess acclaimed him invincible, he advanced into Thrace in spring 335 and, after forcing the Shipka Pass and crushing the Triballi, crossed the Danube to disperse the Geta. Turning west, he then defeated and shattered a coalition of Illyrians who had invaded Macedonia. Meanwhile, a rumor of his death had precipitated a revolt of Theban Democrats. Other Greek states favored Thebes, and the Athenians, urged on by Demosthenes, voted help. In 14 days, Alexander marched 240 miles from Pelion near modern Cork, Albania in Illyria to Thebes. When the Thebans refused to surrender, he made an entry and razed their city to the ground, sparing only temples and Pindar's house. 6,000 were killed and all survivors sold into slavery. The other Greek states were cowed by this severity, and Alexander could afford to treat Athens leniently. Macedonian garrisons were left in Corinth, Chalcis, and Academe, the citadel of Thebes.
Beginnings of the Persian expedition.
From his accession, Alexander had set his mind on the Persian expedition. He had grown up to the idea. Moreover, he needed the wealth of Persia if he was to maintain the army built by Philip and pay off the 500 talents he owed. The exploits of the 10,000 Greek soldiers of fortune and of Agesilaus of Sparta in successfully campaigning in Persian territory had revealed the vulnerability of the Persian Empire. With a good cavalry force, Alexander could expect to defeat any Persian army. In spring 334, he crossed the Dardanelles, leaving Antipater, who had already faithfully served his father, as his deputy in Europe with over 13,000 men. He himself commanded about 30,000 foot and over 5,000 cavalry, of whom nearly 14,000 were Macedonians and about 7,000 allies sent by the Greek League. This army was to prove remarkable for its balanced combination of arms. Much work fell on the light-armed Cretan and Macedonian archers, Thracians, and the Agrianan javelin men. But in pitched battle the striking force was the cavalry and the core of the army. Should the issue still remain undecided after the cavalry charge, was the infantry phalanx, 9,000 strong, armed with 13-foot spears and shields, and the 3,000 men of the royal battalions, the hypaspis. Alexander's second in command was Parmenio, who had secured a foothold in Asia Minor during Philip's lifetime. Many of his family and supporters were entrenched in positions of responsibility. The army was accompanied by surveyors, engineers, architects, scientists, court officials, and historians. From the outset, Alexander seems to have envisaged an unlimited operation. After visiting Ilion Troy, a romantic gesture inspired by Homer, he confronted his first Persian army, led by 3 satraps, at the Granicus modern Kakabak River, near the Sea of Marmara, June 334. The Persian plan to tempt Alexander across the river and kill him in the melee almost succeeded. But the Persian line broke, and Alexander's victory was complete. Darius's Greek mercenaries were largely massacred, but 2,000 survivors were sent back to Macedonia in chains. This victory exposed Western Asia Minor to the Macedonians, and most cities hastened to open their gates. The tyrants were expelled, and in contrast to Macedonian policy in Greece, democracies were installed. Alexander thus underlined his pan-Hellenic policy, already symbolized in the sending of 300 panoplies, sets of armor taken at the Granicus, an offering dedicated to Athena at Athens by Alexander son of Philip, and the Greeks accept the Spartans from the barbarians who inhabit Asia. But the cities remained de facto under Alexander, and his appointment of Kala as satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia reflected his claim to succeed the great king of Persia. When Miletus, encouraged by the proximity of the Persian fleet, resisted, Alexander took it by assault, but, refusing a naval battle, he disbanded his own costly navy and announced that he would defeat the Persian fleet on land by occupying the coastal cities. In Caria, Halicarnassus resisted and was stormed, but Ada, the widow and sister of the satrap Adrius, adopted Alexander as her son and, after expelling her brother Pixodarus, Alexander restored her to her satrapy. Some parts of Caria held out, however, until 332.
Asia Minor and the Battle of Issus.
In winter 334 to 333, Alexander conquered western Asia Minor, subduing the hill tribes of Lycia and Pisidia, and in spring 333 he advanced along the coastal road to Perga, passing the cliffs of Mount Climax, thanks to a fortunate change of wind. The fall in the level of the sea was interpreted as a mark of divine favor by Alexander's flatterers, including the historian Callisthenes. At Gordium in Phrygia, tradition records his cutting of the Gordian knot, which could only be loosed by the man who was to rule Asia. But this story may be apocryphal, or at least distorted. At this point, Alexander benefited from the sudden death of Memnon, the competent Greek commander of the Persian fleet. From Gordium he pushed on to Ankara, modern Ankara, and thence south through Cappadocia and the Cilician Gates, modern Kulek Bokazi. A fever held him up for a time in Cilicia. Meanwhile, Darius with his grand army had advanced northward on the eastern side of Mount Almanus. Intelligence on both sides was faulty, and Alexander was already encamped by Meriandrus near modern Iskenderun, Turkey, when he learned that Darius was astride his line of communications at Issus, north of Alexander's position, autumn 333. Turning, Alexander found Darius drawn up along the Panaris River. In the battle that followed, Alexander won a decisive victory. The struggle turned into a Persian rout and Darius fled, leaving his family in Alexander's hands. The women were treated with chivalrous care.
Conquest of the Mediterranean coast and Egypt.
From Issus, Alexander marched south into Syria and Phoenicia, his object being to isolate the Persian fleet from its bases and so to destroy it as an effective fighting force. The Phoenician cities Marathus and Aratus came over quietly, and Parmenio was sent ahead to secure Damascus and its rich booty, including Darius's war chest. In reply to a letter from Darius offering peace, Alexander replied arrogantly, recapitulating the historic wrongs of Greece and demanding unconditional surrender to himself as Lord of Asia. After taking Byblos, modern Jubail, and Sidon, Arabic Cabe, he met with a check at Tyre, where he was refused entry into the island city. He thereupon prepared to use all methods of siegecraft to take it, but the Tyrians resisted, holding out for 7 months. In the meantime, winter 333 to 332, the Persians had counterattacked by land in Asia Minor, where they were defeated by Antigonus, the satrap of Greater Phrygia, and by sea, recapturing a number of cities and islands. While the siege of Tyre was in progress, Darius sent a new offer. He would pay a huge ransom of 10,000 talents for his family and cede all his lands west of the Euphrates. I would accept, Parmenio is reported to have said, were I Alexander. I too, was the famous retort, were I Parmenio. The storming of Tyre in July 332 was Alexander's greatest military achievement. It was attended with great carnage and the sale of the women and children into slavery. Leaving Parmenio in Syria, Alexander advanced south without opposition until he reached Gaza on its high mound. Their bitter resistance halted him for 2 months, and he sustained a serious shoulder wound during a sortie. There is no basis for the tradition that he turned aside to visit Jerusalem. In November 332 he reached Egypt. The people welcomed him as their deliverer, and the Persian satrap Mazaches wisely surrendered. At Memphis, Alexander sacrificed to Apis, the Greek term for Hapi, the sacred Egyptian bull, and was crowned with the traditional double crown of the pharaohs. The native priests were placated and their religion encouraged. He spent the winter organizing Egypt, where he employed Egyptian governors, keeping the army under a separate Macedonian command. He founded the city of Alexandria near the western arm of the Nile on a fine site between the sea and Lake Mareotis, protected by the island of Pharos, and had it laid out by the Rhodian architect Dinocrates. He is also said to have sent an expedition to discover the causes of the flooding of the Nile. From Alexandria, he marched along the coast to Praetonium, and from there inland to visit the celebrated oracle of the god Amun at Squaw. The difficult journey was later embroidered with flattering legends. On his reaching the oracle in its oasis, the priest gave him the traditional salutation of a pharaoh, as son of Amun. Alexander consulted the god on the success of his expedition, but revealed the reply to no one. Later, the incident was to contribute to the story that he was the son of Zeus and, thus, to his deification. In spring 331, he returned to Tyre, appointed a Macedonian satrap for Syria, and prepared to advance into Mesopotamia. His conquest of Egypt had completed his control of the whole eastern Mediterranean coast. In July 331, Alexander was at Thapsacus on the Euphrates. Instead of taking the direct route down the river to Babylon, he made across northern Mesopotamia toward the Tigris, and Darius, learning of this move from an advance force sent under Mazaeus to the Euphrates crossing, marched up the Tigris to oppose him. The decisive battle of the war was fought on October 31st on the plain of Gaugamela between Nineveh and Arbela. Alexander pursued the defeated Persian forces for 35 miles to Arbela, but Darius escaped with his Bactrian cavalry and Greek mercenaries into Media. Alexander now occupied Babylon, city and province. Mazaeus, who surrendered it, was confirmed as satrap in conjunction with a Macedonian troop commander, and quite exceptionally was granted the right to coin. As in Egypt, the local priesthood was encouraged. Susa, the capital, also surrendered, releasing huge treasures amounting to 50,000 gold talents. Here Alexander established Darius's family in comfort. Crushing the mountain tribe of the Uxians, he now pressed on over the Zagros range into Persia proper and, successfully turning the pass of the Persian gates, held by the satrap Ariobarzanes, he entered Persepolis and Pasargadae. At Persepolis, he ceremonially burned down the palace of Xerxes as a symbol that the Pan-Hellenic War of Revenge was at an end. For such seems the probable significance of an act that tradition later explained as a drunken frolic inspired by Tai, an Athenian courtesan. In spring 330, Alexander marched north into Media and occupied its capital. The Thessalians and Greek allies were sent home. Henceforward, he was waging a purely personal war. As Mazaeus' appointment indicated, Alexander's views on the empire were changing. He had come to envisage a joint ruling people consisting of Macedonians and Persians, and this served to augment the misunderstanding that now arose between him and his people. Before continuing his pursuit of Darius, who had retreated into Bactria, he assembled all the Persian treasure and entrusted it to Harpalus, who was to hold it at Ecbatana as chief treasurer. Parmenio was also left behind in Media to control communications. The presence of this older man had perhaps become irksome. In midsummer 330, Alexander set out for the eastern provinces at a high speed via Regi, modern Ray, near Taran and the Caspian Gates, where he learned that Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, had deposed Darius. After a skirmish near modern Charderd, the usurper had Darius stabbed and left him to die. Alexander sent his body for burial with due honors in the royal tombs at Persepolis.
Campaign eastward to Central Asia.
Darius's death left no obstacle to Alexander's claim to be great king, and a Rhodian inscription of this year 330 calls him Lord of Asia, i.e., of the Persian Empire. Soon afterward, his Asian coins carry the title of king. Crossing the Elborz Mountains to the Caspian, he seized Sajarkarta in Hyrcania and received the submission of a group of satraps and Persian notables, some of whom he confirmed in their offices. In a diversion westward, perhaps to modern Mal, he reduced the Mardi, a mountain people who inhabited the Elborz Mountains. He also accepted the surrender of Darius's Greek mercenaries. His advance eastward was now rapid. In Aria he reduced Sadabarzanes, who had offered submission only to revolt, and he founded Alexandria of the Aryans, modern Hurt. At Frauda in Drengiana, either near modern Nadi Ali in Seistan or farther north at Farah, he at last took steps to destroy Parmenio and his family. Philotas, Parmenio's son, commander of the elite companion cavalry, was implicated in an alleged plot against Alexander's life, condemned by the army, and executed, and a secret message was sent to Clender, Parmenio's second-in-command, who obediently assassinated him. This ruthless action excited widespread horror, but strengthened Alexander's position relative to his critics and those whom he regarded as his father's men. All Parmenio's adherents were now eliminated and men close to Alexander promoted. The companion cavalry was reorganized into sections, each containing 4 squadrons now known as hipparchies. One group was commanded by Alexander's oldest friend, Hephaestion, the other by Cletus, an older man. From Frada, Alexander pressed on during the winter of 330 to 329 up the valley of the Helman River, through Arachosia, and over the mountains past the site of modern Kabul into the country of the Peripamisadae, where he founded Alexandria by the Caucasus. Bessus was now in Bactria, raising a national revolt in the eastern satrapies with the usurped title of Great King. Crossing the Hindu Kush northward over the Kawak Pass 11,650 feet 3,550 meters, Alexander brought his army, despite food shortages, to Drabsaka, sometimes identified with modern Banu and Arab, probably farther north at Kunduz. Outflanked, Bessus fled beyond the Oxus modern Amudarya, and Alexander, marching west to Baktrazuri Aspa, modern Balkways, Irbad and Afghanistan, appointed loyal satraps in Bactria and Arya. Crossing the Oxus, he sent his general Ptolemy in pursuit of Bessus, who had meanwhile been overthrown by the Sogdian Spitamines. Bessus was captured, flogged, and sent to Bactra, where he was later mutilated after the Persian manner, losing his nose and ears. In due course, he was publicly executed at Ecbatana. From Maracanda, modern Samarkand, Alexander advanced by way of Syropolis to the Jaxartes, modern Sirdarya, the boundary of the Persian Empire. There he broke the opposition of the Scythian nomads by his use of catapult sand, after defeating them in a battle on the north bank of the river, pursued them into the interior. On the site of modern Leninabad, cogent on the Jaxartes, he founded a city, Alexandria Eshate, the farthest. Meanwhile, Spitamines had raised all Sogdiana in revolt behind him, bringing in the Masajatai, a people of the Shaka Confederacy. It took Alexander until the autumn of 328 to crush the most determined opponent he encountered in his campaigns. Later in the same year, he attacked Oxyarts and the remaining barons who held out in the hills of Paradisine, modern Tajikistan. Volunteers seized the crag on which Oxyarts had his stronghold, and among the captives was his daughter, Roxana. In reconciliation, Alexander married her, and the rest of his opponents were either won over or crushed. An incident that occurred at Maracanda widened the breach between Alexander and many of his Macedonians. He murdered Cletus, one of his most trusted commanders, in a drunken quarrel, but his excessive display of remorse led the army to pass a decree convicting Cletus posthumously of treason. The event marked a step in Alexander's progress toward Eastern absolutism, and this growing attitude found its outward expression in his use of Persian royal dress. Shortly afterward, at Bactra, he attempted to impose the Persian court ceremonial, involving prostration proskynesis, on the Greeks and Macedonians too, but to them this custom, habitual for Persians entering the king's presence, implied an act of worship and was intolerable before a human. Even Callisthenes, historian and nephew of Aristotle, whose ostentatious flattery had perhaps encouraged Alexander to see himself in the role of a god, refused to abase himself. Macedonian laughter caused the experiment to founder, and Alexander abandoned it. Shortly afterward, however, Callisthenes was held to be privy to a conspiracy among the royal pages and was executed or died in prison. Accounts vary. Resentment of this action alienated sympathy from Alexander within the peripatetic school of philosophers, with which Callisthenes had close connections.
Invasion of India.
In early summer 327, Alexander left Bactria with a reinforced army under a reorganized command. If Plutarch's figure of 120,000 men has any reality, however, it must include all kinds of auxiliary services, together with muleteers, camel drivers, medical corps, peddlers, entertainers, women, and children. The fighting strength perhaps stood at about 35,000. We're crossing the Hindu Kush, probably by Bamiyan and the Gorban Valley. Alexander divided his forces. Half the army, with the baggage under Hephaestion and Perdiccas, both cavalry commanders, was sent through the Khyber Pass, while he himself led the rest, together with his siege train, through the hills to the north. His advance through Sant and Gondora was marked by the storming of the almost impregnable pinnacle of Aornos. The modern piers are, a few miles west of the Indus and north of the Buna River, an impressive feat of siegecraft. In spring 326, crossing the Indus near Adak, Alexander entered Taxila, whose ruler, Taxiles, furnished elephants and troops in return for aid against his rival Pars, who ruled the lands between the Hydaspes modern Jalem and the Assaneans modern Chen. In June, Alexander fought his last great battle on the left bank of the Hydaspes. He founded the cities there, Alexander and Nicaea, to celebrate his victory, and Bucephala named after his horse Bucephalus, which died there, and Pars became his ally. How much Alexander knew of India beyond the Hyphasis, probably the modern Bees, is uncertain. There is no conclusive proof that he had heard of the Ganges. But he was anxious to press on farther, and he had advanced to the Hyphasis when his army mutinied, refusing to go farther in the tropical rain. They were weary in body and spirit, and Coenus, one of Alexander's for chief marshals, acted as their spokesman. On finding the army adamant, Alexander agreed to turn back. On the Hyphasis he erected 12 altars to the 12 Olympian gods, and on the Hydaspes he built a fleet of 800 to 1,000 ships. Leaving Pars, he then proceeded down the river and into the Indus, with half his forces on shipboard and half marching in 3 columns down the 2 banks. The fleet was commanded by Nearchus, and Alexander's own captain was one Zacritus. Both later wrote accounts of the campaign. The march was attended with much fighting and heavy, pitiless slaughter. At the storming of one town of the Mali near the Hydrubs, Ravi River, Alexander received a severe wound which left him weakened. On reaching Patala, located at the head of the Indus Delta, he built a harbor and docks and explored both arms of the Indus, which probably then ran into the Rann of Kach. He planned to lead part of his forces back by land, while the rest in perhaps 100 to 150 ships under the command of Nearchus, a Cretan with naval experience, made a voyage of exploration along the Persian Gulf. Local opposition led Nearchus to set sail in September 325, and he was held up for 3 weeks until he could pick up the northeast monsoon in late October. In September, Alexander to set out along the coast through Gedrosio, modern Baluchistan, but he was soon compelled by mountainous country to turn inland, thus failing in his project to establish food depots for the fleet. Craterus, a high-ranking officer, already had been sent off with the baggage and siege train, the elephants, and the sick and wounded, together with 3 battalions of the phalanx, by way of the Mulla Pass, Quetta, and Kandahar into the Helmand Valley. From there, he was to march through Drengiana to rejoin the main army on the Amanus modern Minab River in Carmania. Alexander's march through Gedrosia proved disastrous. Waterless desert and shortage of food and fuel caused great suffering, and many, especially women and children, perished in a sudden monsoon flood while encamped in a wadi. At length, at the Yamanis, he was rejoined by Nearchus and the fleet, which also had suffered losses.
Consolidation of the empire.
Alexander now proceeded farther with the policy of replacing senior officials and executing defaulting governors on which he had already embarked before leaving India. Between 326 and 324, over a third of his satraps were superseded and 6 were put to death, including the Persian satraps of Persis, Susiana, Carmania, and Paradicene. 3 generals in Media, including Clender, the brother of Coenus who had died a little earlier, were accused of extortion and summoned to Carmania, where they were arrested, tried, and executed. How far the rigor that from now onward Alexander displayed against his governors represents exemplary punishment for gross maladministration during his absence, and how far the elimination of men he had come to distrust, as in the case of Philotas and Parmenio, is debatable. But the ancient sources generally favorable to him comment adversely on his severity. In spring 324, he was back in Susa, capital of Elam and administrative center of the Persian Empire. The story of his journey through Carmania in a drunken revel, dressed as Dionysus, is embroidered, if not wholly apocryphal. He found that his treasurer, Harpalus, evidently fearing punishment for peculation, had absconded with 6,000 mercenaries and 5,000 talents to Greece. Arrested in Athens, he escaped and later was murdered in Crete. At Susa, Alexander held a feast to celebrate the seizure of the Persian Empire, at which, in furtherance of his policy of fusing Macedonians and Persians into one master race, he and 80 of his officers took Persian wives. He and Hephaestion married Darius's daughters Barsai, also called Statera and Drypetus, respectively, and 10,000 of his soldiers with native wives were given generous dowries. This policy of racial fusion brought increasing friction to Alexander's relations with his Macedonians, who had no sympathy for his changed concept of the empire. His determination to incorporate Persians on equal terms in the army and the administration of the provinces was bitterly resented. This discontent was now fanned by the arrival of 30,000 native youths who had received a Macedonian military training, and by the introduction of Asian peoples from Bactria, Sogdiana, Arachosia, and other parts of the empire into the companion cavalry. Whether Asians had previously served with the companions is uncertain, but if so, they must have formed separate squadrons. In addition, Persian nobles had been accepted into the royal cavalry bodyguard. Pusestes, the new governor of Persis, gave this policy full support to flatter Alexander, but most Macedonians saw it as a threat to their own privileged position. The issue came to a head at Opus 324, when Alexander's decision to send home Macedonian veterans under Craterus was interpreted as a move toward transferring the seat of power to Asia. There was an open mutiny involving all but the royal bodyguard. But when Alexander dismissed his whole army and enrolled Persians instead, the opposition broke down. An emotional scene of reconciliation was followed by a vast banquet with 9,000 guests to celebrate the ending of the misunderstanding and the partnership in government of Macedonians and Persians, but not, as has been argued, the incorporation of all the subject peoples as partners in the Commonwealth. 10,000 veterans were now sent back to Macedonia with gifts, and the crisis was surmounted. In summer 324, Alexander attempted to solve another problem, that of the wandering mercenaries, of whom there were thousands in Asia and Greece, many of them political exiles from their own cities. A decree brought by Nicanor to Europe and proclaimed at Olympia, September 324, required the Greek cities of the Greek League to receive back all exiles and their families except the Thebans, a measure that implied some modification of the oligarchic regimes maintained in the Greek cities by Alexander's governor Antipater. Alexander now planned to recall Antipater and supersede him by Craterus, but he was to die before this could be done. In autumn 324, Hephaestion died in Ecbatana, and Alexander indulged in extravagant mourning for his closest friend. He was given a royal funeral in Babylon with a pyre costing 10,000 talents. His post of Chiliarch Grand Vizier was left unfilled. It was probably in connection with the general order now sent out to the Greeks to honor Hephaestion as a hero that Alexander linked the demand that he himself should be accorded divine honors. For a long time, his mind had dwelt on ideas of Godhead. Greek thought drew no very decided line of demarcation between God and man, for legend offered more than one example of men who, by their achievements, acquired divine status. Alexander had on several occasions encouraged favorable comparison of his own accomplishments with those of Dionysus or Heracles. He now seems to have become convinced of the reality of his own divinity and to have required its acceptance by others. There is no reason to assume that his demand had any political background. Divine status gave its possessor no particular rights in a Greek city. It was rather a symptom of growing megalomania and emotional instability. The cities perforce complied, but often ironically, the Spartan decree read, "Since Alexander wishes to be a god, let him be a god." In the winter of 324, Alexander carried out a savage punitive expedition against the Causians in the hills of Lorstan. The following spring at Babylon, he received complimentary embassies from the Libyans and from the Bretons, Etruscans, and Lucanians of Italy. But the story that embassies also came from more distant peoples, such as Carthaginians, Celts, Iberians, and even Romans, is a later invention. Representatives of the cities of Greece also came, garlanded as befitted Alexander's divine status. Following up Nearchus's voyage, he now founded in Alexandria at the mouth of the Tigris and made plans to develop sea communications with India, for which an expedition along the Arabian coast was to be a preliminary. He also dispatched Heraclides, an officer, to explore the Hyrcanian, i.e., Caspian Sea, suddenly, in Babylon. While busy with plans to improve the irrigation of the Euphrates and to settle the coast of the Persian Gulf, Alexander was taken ill after a prolonged banquet and drinking bout. 10 days later, on June 13, 323, he died in his 33rd year. He had reigned for 12 years and 8 months. His body, diverted to Egypt by Ptolemy, the later king, was eventually placed in a golden coffin in Alexandria. Both in Egypt and elsewhere in the Greek cities, he received divine honors. No heir had been appointed to the throne, and his generals adopted Philip II's half-witted illegitimate son, Philipporideus, and Alexander's posthumous son by Roxana, Alexander IV, as kings, sharing out the satrapies among themselves, after much bargaining. The empire could hardly survive Alexander's death as a unit. Both kings were murdered, Aridaeus in 317 and Alexander in 310-309. The provinces became independent kingdoms, and the generals, following Antigonus's lead in 306, took the title of king.
Evaluation of Alexander the Great.
Of Alexander's plans, little reliable information survives. The far-reaching schemes for the conquest of the Western Mediterranean and the setting up of a universal monarchy, recorded by Diodorus Siculus, a first-century Greek historian, are probably based on a later forgery. If not, they were at once jettisoned by his successors and the army. Had he lived, he would no doubt have completed the conquest of Asia Minor, where Paphlagonia, Cappadocia, and Armenia still maintained an effective independence. But in his later years, Alexander's aims seem to have been directed toward exploration, in particular of Arabia and the Caspian. In the organization of his empire, Alexander had been content in many spheres to improvise and adapt what he found. His financial policy is an exception, though the details cannot be wholly recovered. It is clear that he set up a central organization with collectors perhaps independent of the local satraps. That this proved a failure was partly due to weaknesses in the character of Harpalus, his chief treasurer. But the establishment of a new coinage with a silver standard based on that of Athens in place of the old bimetallic system current both in Macedonia and in Persia helped trade everywhere and, combined with the release of vast amounts of bullion from the Persian treasuries, gave a much-needed fillip to the economy of the whole Mediterranean area. Alexander's foundation of new cities, Plutarch speaks of over 70, initiated a new chapter in Greek expansion. No doubt many of the colonists, by no means volunteers, deserted these cities, and marriages with native women led to some dilution of Greek ways. But the Greek rather than Macedonian influence remained strong in most of them. Since the process was carried further by Alexander's Seleucid successors, the spread of Hellenic thought and customs over much of Asia as far as Bactria and India was one of the more striking effects of Alexander's conquests. His plans for racial fusion, on the other hand, were a failure. The Iranian satraps were perhaps not efficient, for, out of 18, 10 were removed or executed with what justice it is no longer possible to say. But, more important, the Macedonians, leaders and men alike, rejected the idea, and in the later Seleucid Empire, the Greek and Macedonian element was to be clearly dominant. How far Alexander would have succeeded in the difficult task of coordinating his vast dominions, had he lived, is hard to determine. The only link between the many units that went to make up an empire more disparate than that of the Habsburgs, and far larger, was his own person, and his death came before he could tackle this problem. What had so far held it all together was his own dynamic personality. He combined an iron will and ability to drive himself and his men to the utmost with a supple and flexible mind. He knew when to draw back and change his policy, though he did this reluctantly. He was imaginative and not without romantic impulses. Figures like Achilles, Heracles, and Dionysus were often in his mind, and the salutation at the Oracle of Ammon clearly influenced his thoughts and ambitions ever afterward. He was swift in anger, and under the strain of his long campaigns, this side of his character grew more pronounced. Ruthless and self-willed, he had increasing recourse to terror, showing no hesitation in eliminating men whom he had ceased to trust, either with or without the pretense of a fair trial. Years after his death, Cassander, son of Antipater, a regent of the Macedonian Empire under Alexander, could not pass his statue at Delphi without shuddering. Yet he maintained the loyalty of his men, who followed him to the Hyphasis without complaining and continued to believe in him throughout all hardships. Only when his whim would have taken them still farther into unknown India did he fail to get his way. As a general, Alexander is among the greatest the world has known. He showed unusual versatility, both in the combination of different arms and in adapting his tactics to the challenge of enemies who commanded novel forms of warfare, the Shaka nomads, the Indian hill tribes, or Pars with his elephants. His strategy was skillful and imaginative, and he knew how to exploit the chances that arise in every battle and may be decisive for victory or defeat. He also drew the last advantage from victory by relentless pursuit. His use of cavalry was so effective that he rarely had to fall back upon his infantry to deliver the crushing blow. Alexander's short reign marks a decisive moment in the history of Europe and Asia. His expedition and his own personal interest in scientific investigation brought many advances in the knowledge of geography and natural history. His career led to the moving of the great centers of civilization eastward and initiated the new age of the Greek territorial monarchies. It spread Hellenism in a vast colonizing wave throughout the Middle East and created, if not politically, at least economically and culturally, a single world stretching from Gibraltar to the Punjab, open to trade and social intercourse, and with a considerable overlay of common civilization and the Greek coin as a lingua franca. It is not untrue to say that the Roman Empire, the spread of Christianity as a world religion, and the long centuries of Byzantium were all in some degree the fruits of Alexander's achievement.